Well, we are approaching the end of the year, which means that it is once again a good time to look at all the available options as you address your volunteer reporting needs within Service. There are a lot of different types of reports that you may choose to run depending on your organizational needs, or potentially things like grant writing. These can be as simple as selecting a date range and clicking Run Report, or they can be more involved if you're looking for particular pieces of information. But we'll explore all the different types of reports available and how you can customize them to pull the information that you are looking for. And as we're going through this, please use the chat if you have questions about specific types of data you'd like to see in a report and how to run that. Our team will answer those questions for you directly. So a good place to start with this conversation is defining some terms. The word report gets thrown around a lot in a lot of different circles, and it can mean different things. So I want to define a few different terms today as we begin. So reporting, searching, and exporting. Those are all kind of different mechanics in Service, but they all can be used sort of interchangeably depending on what you're talking about. So let's kind of define those for today, and then we'll work within those parameters. In Service, the term report typically refers to any kind of report that you might pull or sheet that you might pull that includes hours information. So you're talking about activities, you're talking about the numbers of hours that volunteers have served. So getting those numbers from the system, how many volunteers have been working with you, what have they been doing, how many hours have they been serving. So that term report we use primarily when we're talking about pulling those numbers. Exporting information, on the other hand, can be run in a couple different places throughout Service. So for example, in the volunteer database side, if we go into search and manage volunteer database, if you want to, for example, pull all of your volunteers for a mail merge, perhaps you're doing a Christmas mailer, or maybe you just want to pull addresses, there is a direct address export as well. But if we just look for our entire volunteer database, or maybe search for a more specific subset, if we leave this search here blank, click Search Volunteer Database, that'll show us everyone in the system. We can select everyone from there, and then in the drop-down, there's a number of different exports that we can run. These are referred to in here as printouts or downloads, so you can print out name tags, you can print out or download address labels, you can download a PDF, or you can download a spreadsheet. I do want to point out this spreadsheet. If you do need to perform a data export, this is an excellent tool. If we click download here, there are two default spreadsheets built into the system, a basic contact info and then a full spreadsheet, but you can also create a custom export profile. So for example, if you are doing a mail merge and you want some specific information included along with the volunteer's name and address, you can go through here and select which fields you want to include or maybe exclude. You can choose the order of these fields as they show up in the spreadsheet. So if you're doing a mail merge, that can be really helpful in kind of dictating that line item. And then of course, give this a title. From there, you can choose if this is public, so anyone in your system can use it, of course, beyond volunteers, or private, only the person who made it and administrators. But you can go ahead and save that as an export and then use that whenever you want to. So again, just backing up, the term reporting generally refers to things that run numbers. You know, you're looking for hours, you're looking for the numbers of volunteers, things like that. Exporting would be pulling data out of the system. Like in the volunteer database side, we just looked at that spreadsheet. There are a few other ways to do that. One in this listing as well, actually. If we look down a little bit further, you can download a volunteer CSV in the same format that we do imports. And then you can also do an export like this on the event side. So if you want to export event information, you can do that as well. And there's one other term to do with reporting that I want to briefly define, and that would be searching. So a lot of times you might think, I want to pull a report of my new volunteers so that I can email them. Well, in that case, you're not necessarily running a report per se. You're running a search, and then you're engaging with the results of that search. Now, searching in Service is very robust. We'll look at this as we get into the different report types today. But just in brief, under the volunteer management side, you have the advanced volunteer search. And if we go into this menu, there's a lot of different options within here. And I'll make sure to point out a few of these today. But I mentioned the concept of new volunteers. Maybe you want to see the list of all of your volunteers who participated for the first time last month. You can use the participation options in here. So go down to volunteer participation options, and there's a section in here that says find volunteers that participated or will participate, if you want to forecast this, in their first activity between these two dates. So if I want to find all the volunteers that participated for their first activity in October of this year, I can just go and set that as my date range here. And then when I run this search, it's going to pull up all the individuals who had their first registration in the system in that time frame. And then again, if I want to email these results, I'm not necessarily going to run a report on this. I would just select those results here and then go and send those people an email. So those are kind of the different terms within the world of reporting, and we're going to come back to these as we look at the different types of reports available to you. But I wanted to briefly define those in Service and kind of what, a report versus a data export versus just running a search might look like. So let's get into a few different reports that you might run as an end of year report. So under the volunteer management heading, at the bottom of that section, we have report management. Now you might have a report that you just want to pull quickly. Maybe you just need the totals for all your volunteers within a certain time frame or broken out by month. There's a number of reports that you can run in this page that will give you those totals or those numbers with kind of one or two button presses. Most of these reports will use at the top of the page this date range. So if I wanted to do, for example, year to date, I can go and set January 1st as the start date and leave today as the end date. That's the default on this page. But of course, I could change that. Maybe I want to forecast through the end of the year. You can do that with these reports, but we'll just leave that as year to date for now. And then we have several reports. We're going to skip number 1 for now, but there are several reports where you might just leave the defaults and click Run Report. Now, a lot of these reports will use a parameter at the top of the page as well to define what type of document you're actually pulling out of the system. So if we look up at the top next to that date range, you can choose the format as either a Word document or a spreadsheet. Some of the reports prefer or will only allow one version or the other, so it doesn't actually matter. For example, in the first report, this says spreadsheet only. It doesn't matter what you have selected here. It's always going to be a spreadsheet. But some of the others that are more like quick printouts, you can choose if you want a Word document or if you want a spreadsheet. But if we look at this report number 2, for example, this one is called the Event or Project Participation Report. It uses the date range at the top of the page. That's what this calendar icon here means. You can apply some filters. Maybe you want to change the detail level, or you want to sort by date or by name. You can search for events by keyword. But if you just want to view everything in that time frame, leave this blank, click over here on Run Report, and then that will essentially just pull that document for you. So again, I chose to do a Word document, and that's going to look something like this, where we just get, in this case, I chose low detail, so we get the total for each opportunity that occurred within that time frame. And then at the bottom, we get totals at the bottom of the report as well for that entire time frame. Now, I want to talk about some of these numbers here, and then we'll look at some other examples of reports as well. So we can see here there are a few different numbers that we're getting when we run this report. We see the number of opportunities, which would be how many events or projects took place within that time frame. A time slot event counts as one opportunity, regardless of how many time slots there are. Next to that, we have volunteers, and there's an asterisk next to this that says the volunteers value includes numbers only for individual volunteers and not group registrations. So you might make the assumption when you're running reports that every group that comes in, if you're doing bulk registrations, every person is an individual. And they're unique, but Service doesn't make that assumption because there's not really a way to verify that per se. So this number, the unique volunteer count, represents how many people have their own profiles in Service and participated within this time frame or within the parameters of the report that you're running. So in this particular example, again, we ran report number 2. I didn't apply any filters, and it was just year to date. So what this is saying is I have 240 unique volunteers with their own accounts in the system who registered for at least one opportunity between January 1st of this year and today. The registrations number next to that, you can think of this kind of like a turnstile. This is how many people actually participated, whether it was the same person 1,600 times or 1,600 different people. This one will include group registrations. It's basically just the number of bodies that came through the door, not necessarily caring who it was. And then hours is exactly how many hours were served, right? This is a pretty straightforward one. Again, it doesn't care if it's individual volunteers or groups. This will give you your total number of hours. So if I just briefly wanted a total for my system, this is one way to grab that so we can see kind of a snapshot of what took place during the calendar year. Now, you might want that to be presented in a different manner. This particular report is giving us the names of each opportunity and the totals for each opportunity, which might be useful for you, but perhaps you'd rather see that on a volunteer total. So each person and how many hours they served. So that would be basically the next report in the list. Number 3 is volunteer participation report. This will do the same kind of thing. We're going to get totals in this report, but this will only show individuals in the system. And then we basically get a total for each person. There's other ways to run this kind of report too. We're going to look at the custom participation report later. If you need to pull more information from the volunteer profile, that one's a little bit more robust. But if you just want a quick snapshot, this is a way to do that. An important thing to note, this report excludes bulk registrations. So what I mean by that is bulk group registrations. So these numbers, if you had memorized the previous page, these numbers are a little bit lower because we're not including bulk group registrations. So that would be if you want totals by volunteer. There's a group participation report if you want a total for a particular group. The 5th report type is interest category participation. This one will give you a total for your interest categories. So basically, the sets of events within the different folders that you've established. I find this to be a particularly useful report if you're using your interest categories, to establish where your events are taking place or what program they're a part of, which is what these typically represent. When you run this report, you can choose to show all categories, or you can select a particular category if you only want to view the opportunities within that category, so you can limit the scope here. If you select a category that has subcategories, so for example, I have this interest category called warehouse with 3 subcategories. If I select that, it will include the 3 subcategories as well. And then this report can also be run for either your primary category or the secondary category on an opportunity, or both. If you're running this report to view all of your hours spread across your categories and make sure you're not missing anything, I would leave this as show all and then run it for primary, because every opportunity that you create in your system must have a primary category. They don't necessarily have to have a secondary category. If you've been pedantic about making sure every event has a secondary category, then this can be useful. Like in my system, I choose a primary category as a program and a secondary category as a location. So if I run the same report and choose secondary, I will view all of my hours by location rather than by program. But if you just want to be sure in your system you're seeing everything, leave this as show all and primary. And again, this was basically just going to give you the totals for those categories in this case. So I did a low detail again. And then down at the bottom, we get totals for the entire system. So same numbers we saw previously. Now I want to talk for a minute about the detail levels in these reports, and then we'll get into some other examples and different versions of reports. So I've been showing you a bunch of low detail reports, which basically gives you kind of the minimum amount of information for that type of report. Now this is an interest category report, so low detail gives us the totals for each category, and then totals down at the very bottom. If I was to change this to medium detail or high detail, then it will essentially just expand the amount of data that we're receiving in the report. Let me show you the high detail version, and then you'll be able to kind of infer what the medium detail is, and we'll talk about that. So if we run this high detail report, we're getting the same totals down at the bottom. So if we scroll all the way to the bottom, the totals are the same here, but you can see now obviously way more pages in this report. The high detail version of this report and the high detail version of most reports shows every single registration as its own line in the report. So we can see, not just the category like we saw in the low detail. Now we see the name of each opportunity within that category, and then we get totals for those opportunities. This is basically the medium detail. And then the high detail is showing us every single registration. So who participated, how many hours did they serve? So we see essentially every single registration in this version of this report, and we get totals for, each event and then each category. And then of course, down at the bottom, a total for the entire report. So that same kind of structure of doing low, medium, or high detail exists within the other report types, just depending on what the structure of the report is. So for example, the event or project participation report, the low detail version gave us a summary for each event. High detail would give us every single registration. So it would show us each person who had registered. Okay, the next report that I want to show is this yearly participation summary. This is another report that you can run pretty quickly. There are ways to make this a little more complex if you're looking for specific data, but you can also run this pretty quickly, especially if you'd like to get a month-to-month breakdown. That's essentially what this report does. You choose your starting month. So if we want to start in January of 2024, we can leave that here, or maybe you want to start on like when your fiscal year starts. So perhaps you start in June, right? You can select when you want this report to start, and then it will give you 12 months from that month. So you'll basically get 1 year's worth of data, getting a summary for each month. So if we go and choose this, we'll just say November, let's do October of 2023 as our starting month, and then it'll give us basically 1 year. So if we run this report, again, there's detail levels if I want to have more information. But if we run this report, the lowest detail is going to be the month. So we get October of 2023, we had 17 unique volunteers, 2 events, 17 registrations, 50 hours, right? And so we can see that for each month, we're just getting the totals. And then down at the bottom, we get the totals for that entire time frame. So again, if you want a month-to-month summary, this is a very quick way to run that, regardless if you're looking for calendar year or a fiscal year. You pick where you're starting, what your start month is, and then it'll build the report from there. And as you might assume, the different detail levels here will just tell you what all is actually happening within that time frame. So medium detail would show you all the events. High detail would show you every single registration. Now, I wanted to get into some more specific reports that you can run that might require maybe running a search ahead of time. Perhaps you're only looking to view hours served by volunteers that participated for the first time this year, right? So when all your volunteers who signed up for the first time this calendar year, what did they do? How many hours did they serve? So any kind of report like that where you're looking to find a specific set of volunteers or a specific set of events would require that you first go and run a search for the most part. There are some reports in here where you can kind of limit the results. Like we looked at interest category, I can just pick a category through here. But let's take this example of finding volunteers who served for the first time this year. Well, what all did they do? So I can go into the advanced volunteer search, go down to the participation options like we looked at earlier, and I can say find volunteers that participated or will participate in their first activity between these dates. So in this case, again, I want to find all my volunteers who served for the first time this year. So that will search for that set of individuals. And then I can take those results. I don't need to do anything on this page, but if I go into reporting now, the system will remember that search that I ran. So there's a couple reports that I can run to limit the results. The first report, we're going to come back to this in a second, but you can see it has this query. If we jump down, there's a few other reports with this same kind of concept. And actually the yearly participation summary that we just looked at also has this. So I could go in here and say, okay, I do want to get a summary of the year by month, but I only want to look at my new volunteers. I don't want to include volunteers who've worked with me in years past. right? So again, I'm narrowing the scope. I'm trying to figure out some more information about maybe retention or how much people do if they are a first-time volunteer. So I can essentially use this report to limit who I'm looking for by using this query, right? So let's look back up at the first report type. It has the same sort of structure here. You can see it has these query options, which are ways for you to tell the system, hey, I don't want to look at all the information necessarily. You can leave it as all volunteers or all opportunities, but you can run a search too. So I could go and search for, like in this case, all my first-time volunteers in 2024, and say I want to use my previous volunteer search as my query, which means I'm not going to see any other volunteers in this report. This report has the other query options in here too. I can run searches for particular groups if I want to, or particular opportunities. Maybe I only want to see first-time volunteers, within a certain category, or within a particular set of events. I could go and run a search for a set of events on the opportunity side, and view, a specific set of opportunities in that scenario. But let's leave this as all opportunities. This report has a couple other parameters to it. I can choose a detail level, low or high. As you might assume, we talked about this earlier. Low detail just gives us totals. So if I'm grouping by volunteer, I'm getting a total for each person. So essentially, like how many times did they serve in this year or in this time frame? And then also how many hours did they serve? You can also group this report by opportunity if you prefer. And then high detail would show every single registration as its own row. Now, this report also allows us to include as much or as little volunteer information as we want to. There's a lot of data in here. Most of this is just pulled straight from your volunteers' profiles, but there are a couple things that I want to point out. In particular, one that was added this year that you might not have seen before, and that's the last service activity date. This would be the most recent date that someone actually participated with you. So that that a volunteer was registered for an event, and that event has already passed. So you can include that date in there if you want to. You can include things like their lifetime hours or lifetime activity count if you want to kind of compare that. Now, in this particular report, their totals for the report and their lifetime hours would be the same, because remember, I'm searching for people who are new this year and then everything they did this year, right? But if you're looking for like your entire database and you want to compare how many hours they did this year versus how many hours they've done total, you can include those columns in this report. There's also a set of options related to the opportunity itself. You can see this says displayed in high detail only. So these options will only appear if you're choosing to show every registration using the high detail version of this report. Now, if we run this report, and I'll do high detail here. Actually, let's do low detail first, then we'll do high detail second. If we do low detail here and we run this report, it's going to be a spreadsheet. Even though I had Word document selected, this report only runs as a spreadsheet. And then you can see the columns are represented by the data that I chose to include in this report. So I had selected lifetime activity count, lifetime hours, but then we also get the report totals. So registration count and hours served. And again, these are all the people who were new this year, so all of these numbers should effectively match up. But essentially, this is just showing us, those volunteers in this time frame, and we're getting a sum for each person. And then down at the bottom, we also get our totals. So the same numbers we looked at earlier, the unique volunteers, total opportunities, registration count, and total hours. So the nice thing about this report, there's several nice things about it, but one of them is that this is a plain spreadsheet. It's very easy to sort by any of these columns. If you want to see like who served the most this calendar year or different metrics like that, it's pretty easy to pull that kind of information. So that's that low detail version. This same report in a high detail version would show you every single registration. So we're not just going to get the totals for each person. We're going to see every single registration. And again, we could include information about the shift itself. Did they sign in? When did they sign in? Did they have a registration note? Did they use a reservation code? All of that stuff can be included on here as well. You also have a registration source option, which we've talked about this in past webinars. You can use registration sources to track who signs up from particular links. For example, you could create like a QR code for a flyer that would track who signed up using that particular QR code. If you have questions about that, again, we addressed that in a different webinar. We're not really going to get into that today, but you can include those sources in this report as well. One nice thing about this report, if you sit down and figure out all of the searches that you want to run and all of the data that you want to include in this report, once you've kind of nailed all of that down, you can go down here and save report parameters. So you can give it a title and then make it either private or shared. And then whenever you want to reuse this report, you would just go in and click on Load Saved Report Parameters, pick from the list which one you want to use, load that up. It will rerun your searches, make all the selections, and then all you have to do is make sure that the date range reflects what you're looking for this report, and then run it. There is a new option here that to replace saved reports. So if you have a previously saved report that you want to modify a little bit, maybe add a column or remove a column, you can load that up and then make your change, and then click on Replace Saved Report, select from the list, type the word replace, and then you can replace that. So this report is highly flexible. There's a lot of different ways to use it. In particular, because it allows you to use these queries, so you can look for specific sets or subsets of volunteers, kind of depending on what your needs are. Okay, there are a couple more things that I want to point out just in the realm of reporting, and then we can move into any questions if there are any that we need from the entire group. So one thing I want to mention that was added relatively recently, and I sort of addressed this earlier as well, you can include on this first report type the last service activity date, and then also including down here like lifetime activity count, lifetime hours. This is newer, including this information. But this last service activity date is also a searchable metric. So you could search for volunteers who came in most recently in a certain time frame. Or of course, you could just include that in the report if you want to pull that information or export that data. This can also be included in the spreadsheet that we looked at earlier. So if you need to pull that information out and plug it into some other resource or some other platform, you can do that. But I wanted to point out in the advanced volunteer search, under participation options, you have the ability to find volunteers based on when that most recent service activity date is. So if you wanted to see people who most recently came in, 6 months ago, or, in July, or maybe in the holidays of last year, and that was the last time they worked with you, you could go and search by a date range like that, and it would show you only the people that, most recently came in that time frame. So they haven't participated since then. So this can be really helpful, especially for trying to re-engage volunteers if they're seasonal, or re-engage volunteers that might have dropped off a little bit, or just finding out some metrics like that about your system. Now, kind of along those lines, we recently did a webinar on volunteer retention as a whole, but I do want to point out that in report management, there is a report in here for volunteer retention kind of mechanisms or just different numbers in here. So again, we did a webinar on this subject, which I'd encourage you to go and review if you have questions about that. But this report will basically pull numbers and totals, like who participated within a certain time frame and how many of those people came back, year after year, that kind of data. Okay, there's one more thing that I want to mention about reporting in total, and that would be how volunteers can pull their own report. So if a volunteer is logged into their own account, at the bottom of the portal, there's a report management section, and they can go into view or print volunteer activity history. And from here, they can set a date range, select the events that showed up in that time frame. You can allow them to select different metrics. If you are tracking different impact tracking metrics, those can show up in here, although you can disable that as well. But basically, they can select a date range through here, select those events, then down at the bottom, click to either print or email their report. If they print it, it will create a PDF download. This PDF uses a header image, which is in your system configuration. If you want to change that, contact our customer support team. Obviously, this is our demonstration console, so it has our kind of letterhead here. But below that, you can see this report tells when it was run, who it's for, and all the activity. Anything that has already occurred will be listed as service hours. Anything that is scheduled will be listed as scheduled, and they don't count towards the total at the bottom. And then if this person is, let's say, turning these hours in for school or work or for community service, they can, basically the person they turned it into can go to this link and input this code to verify the report or scan this QR code to do kind of both of those steps at once. Essentially, this will take them to a page where they can verify the report and download a verified version of it, which is essentially the same thing, except that it says official verified copy down at the bottom, as opposed to having the option to scan the QR code, right? That's on the version that the volunteers print out. So again, volunteers can create this report themselves. There's actually two places where they can do that. One is through their profile, like we just showed, so they can log in and print that report. And we do have a YouTube video laying out how volunteers can do that. But another place that volunteers can print this report is through your sign-in console. They can essentially email it to themselves if you turn that on. So there's a setting in the system configuration under the sign-in console or kiosk options to allow volunteers to access their activity history via the sign-in console. So you can set this to yes, and then essentially when the sign-in console is open, a volunteer can access that same report mechanic, and they could email the report to themselves, or they could have it printed right then and there if you have a printer connected. So as an admin, of course, you can always pull that information as well. You can run the same kind of report just by going through the volunteer database, looking up an individual, going to view their activities. You can set a date range at the top here, select those results, and then print a PDF. So you can do the same kind of thing on the admin side, but volunteers have access to run that same kind of report. Okay, so there are a lot of different ways to run reports within Service. We've walked through a number of very specific options, but as you have specific reporting needs, or if there are certain things that you are looking for, please don't hesitate to reach out to our customer support team with those questions. You can contact our support by, when you're logged in, clicking on the Need Help button at the bottom of the page. Run a search for a specific topic. We do have a lot of articles on reporting and different subjects within that realm. So if you want to just read up on this, you can do that as well. But you can always click on Contact Us and submit a ticket through here, especially if you're unsure how to pull a specific piece of information or how to run a report that includes the data that you need or a breakdown that you need. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. We're happy to help you work through that. The reporting options within Service and the searching options within Service make it pretty easy to run reports and pull really exactly what you're looking for. So if you have questions about that, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have any questions about some of the other things that we talked about today, like impact tracking, or I mentioned volunteer retention, again, all of our past webinars on those different kind of subjects can be found at our YouTube channel. If you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you there. You can also just go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies. But all of our past recorded webinars get posted here. You can go through and review those. We also have playlists built out on different subjects. And then I wanted to mention that video for volunteers to print their own activity history. You can send that to volunteers if you'd like to. It basically just walks through the steps of how to pull up that particular report. All right. Well, that is kind of the subject that we had for today, and we've covered all of that. It sounds like most of the questions that came in were specific to reports that you wanted to run, so that's good. Please feel free to keep asking those questions. I'm going to leave the webinar open a little bit here to make sure that those get answered, and if you have more questions, you can write those in. But we are done with the content that we have for today. So thank you so much for joining. It is a delight to get to work with all of you. I know I've worked with a lot of you personally, so thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join. And we look forward to chatting with you again in our next webinar.